Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. I'm Jen Jordan. I'm the recycling coordinator for the City of Iowa City, and this is one of our first events for America Recycles Day, which is the Saturday, November 15th. We have a whole bunch of events planned. I don't have a list of them here, but you can check them out on the website, and there's apparently a bunch of food stuff going on campus this week and next as well, so check those out as well. Well, if I can find them, I'll link to them. But today we're very honored to have Sapna here, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce her last name, even though she told me how, because I will butcher it, so I'll let her say that. But just a very informal introduction. We just met this afternoon. We came to have Sapna here today just in working with a University of Iowa professor who did a tour at the Iowa City Landfill and the Iowa City Recycling Center a few weeks ago and mentioned, or probably longer than that now, but mentioned in passing that she had an author coming this week to speak with her class, and I said, well, can we have her speak to the public as well? So it worked out, and here she is. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So my name is Sapna Thottahil. Thank you for coming to listen to me speak today. I'm going to speak about my new book, which just came out from the University of Iowa Press, and my editor, Catherine, is in the audience. And the book is called India's Organic Farming Revolution. I thought I'd read from the preface because it really explains who I am and how I came to ask the questions that I did that led to writing this book. And I'll also give you a little bit more perspective of being a consumer and why a consumer should care about production happening halfway across the world. And I think there are some implications, there are many implications actually, for production here in Iowa as well. Okay. So the foreword is called From India to My Plate. When the British government announced in 2000 that it would cut 60% of its greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 to mitigate climate change, no one expected that this plan would conflict with sustainable development and poverty alleviation in countries like India. Unfortunately, development agencies, nonprofit organizations, and religious groups soon found themselves working at cross purposes with each other. The problem was food miles. As consumers, activists, and policymakers began to realize that the distance that food travels to reach us could increase its carbon footprint, the amount of energy required to bring food from seed to plate, importing fresh produce and dry goods from afar seemed increasingly like a bad idea. Several organizations therefore advocated that British consumers only buy local food. The logic went like this. If everyone were to lower their food miles by consuming smaller amounts of imported goods and greater amounts of local produce instead, less air, ship, and rail transportation would be needed to bring imported foods into Britain. The consumption of fewer fossil fuels and less energy in shipping would lead to a smaller amount of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, and climate change's disastrous effects could potentially be forestalled. So this is actually a photo from a rally that I attended when I was living in London in 2005. At the time, the President of the United States was George Bush, and that's one of the reasons why his photo is on a poster in the picture. And at the time, the U.S. did not have an official stance on climate change, and this angered many consumers and activists in England, and they were looking frantically for ways to decrease their carbon footprint, and food was identified as a place where that could happen, and therefore the fixation on food miles. Organizations dedicated to development, on the other hand, found themselves conflicted about this announcement from the British government. Oxfam, for example, had been promoting organic and fair trade farming in the developing world as a sustainable development strategy for years. It hoped that connecting poor, organic farmers in places like Africa and India to premium export markets, typically in countries that formerly colonized them, would augment farmers' incomes and improve their livelihoods. But Oxfam was also committed to mitigating climate change and supported the goals set by the British government. Meanwhile, British consumers concerned about these issues were becoming confused about which products they could ethically buy from grocery stores. For example, when given the choice between local British apples or Fairtrade apples from South Africa, produced with minimal chemical inputs, what were they supposed to select? This is precisely a choice I encountered at a store in Oxford, England in 2005. At the time, I was not sure which to purchase. I hemmed and hawed, oscillating between the selections, and then eventually bought both, using my research as justification. And I was in a class yesterday at the University of Iowa here, and we discussed these choices with a lot of the students. And these are choices that consumers are still having to make when at the grocery store today, here in Iowa and across the US and in England. Between 2005 and 2006, I studied the trade-offs between fair trade and local foods while earning a master's degree from Oxford University. To gauge consumer attitudes, I interviewed 460 shoppers at retail food outlets in England. I discovered that many people grappled with similar concerns about their food. Said one customer to me when given the choice between an organic apple from abroad and a local apple produced conventionally, quote, "I personally never ever buy a foreign apple. They taste disgusting. They're revolting. If you can get them banned, I'd be for it. They are disgusting." End quote. Another consumer expressed less scorn and more anxiety. Quote, "I tend to buy local food rather than imported, although I then worry that by not buying and supporting developing economies, I condemn the third world to continuing poverty." End quote. And yet another shopper told me, quote, "I am often unsure whether to buy organic." End quote. Through these interviews, I unearthed a diversity of feelings, mixtures of doubt, disdain, and even paternalism toward countries like India that export food to the United States and Europe. While I found that several consumers focused on questions of taste and provenance, whereas others emphasized farmers' livelihoods, I also found that most people were uncertain about how to make sense of competing arguments while shopping. Further, I began noticing that these consumer opinions echoed growing debates about the place of organic agriculture in our global industrial food system. Soon after I conducted these interviews, Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma hit bookstores. Exasperatedly, he described difficulties, much like those I had encountered, in determining the merits of various ethical products in a Whole Foods grocery store in California. The answer to what to eat for dinner, he concluded, was not simple. And it's still not simple. This book is not about consumers, but organic producers. Asking myself what to eat for dinner prompted me not just to think about what I was buying, but to study organic practices hundreds of miles away from Oxford, England, as well as from my home in the United States. I wanted to explore how the food I bought was produced, to find an answer to the dilemma I had identified in 2005. Is there an inherent conflict between sustainable agriculture and a globalized world? My interest in this question wasn't purely intellectual. As a first-generation Indian American whose family historically engaged in farming, the issue of sustainable food imports and exports piqued my interests. I'm the daughter of farmers who chose to leave their home in Kerala, a state in southern India, and their agricultural roots to work in other professions in the United States. As a child growing up in America, if I happened to express any hesitation over finishing the vegetables on my dinner plate, my father would often say sternly that poor children were likely going hungry in India at that very moment. While parents may frequently scold their children for neglecting their vegetables, my father's reprimands had a personal meaning. Although he grew up on a farm in Kerala, surrounded by family with extensive knowledge of agriculture, he experienced hunger on a regular basis. His parents and siblings often did not have enough money from their agricultural work to buy food. The oldest child in his family, my father was born a few years after World War II, when a combination of global, political, and ecological factors caused the newly formed nation of India to experience severe food shortages. I just want to take a pause here. There's a great editorial op-ed in today's New York Times written by Mark Bittman about hunger and poverty around the world. And so if you're interested in learning more about the relationship between both, I recommend checking that out in the New York Times today. In moments of reflection and reminiscing, my father would sometimes share with me his strategies for combating hunger while he was young, including drinking a lot of water so that he would feel full. Eventually, both my father and mother pursued another strategy to lessen their agrarian hardships. They left farming in India to pursue occupations with fewer risks and more rewards halfway around the world. To understand the global economic system that structured my parents' choices, as well as the contemporary food system, I decided to continue my research on food and agriculture through a PhD program in geography at the University of California, Berkeley. When it came time to doing my fieldwork, I went back to my parents' former home in Kerala, spending 14 months there between 2009 and 2011, studying farming practices and access to global markets. These 2 years were an exciting time to be in Kerala because in 2010, the state promulgated a policy to convert its entire agricultural production to organic practices within 10 years. While in Kerala, I spent time with farmers in their fields, attended organic agriculture training sessions and conferences, interviewed policymakers and government officials, and traveled throughout South India to study and analyze its emerging organic farming sector. Close to 9,000 farmers were farming organically in Kerala by the time I left. They had diverse and complex reasons for doing so, reasons that American and European scholars and journalists had largely overlooked. For my time in India, I discovered that the politics of our contemporary food system are intertwined with the complex history of colonialism, free trade agreements, and exchange between local and distant cultures, flora, and fauna. Food and agriculture in one place are intimately interconnected with food and agriculture in other places. Therefore, the question of what to consume or produce in any country has global implications. Muddying this picture, however, is the fact that the agri-food system is not a level playing field. Its multifaceted history has produced a world where millions of people remain malnourished, even though the overall global acreage devoted to agriculture has increased and produces enough food for everyone alive today. And Mark Bittman talks about that in his op-ed today. Much of that food is left to rot or is diverted for fuel, or it remains unavailable or too expensive for those who need it because of financial speculation in commodities, the inadequacy of distribution networks, and poor wages. Many people just cannot afford to buy food in today's world. Moreover, and ironically, the growing footprint of agricultural production is contributing to several health-related and environmental problems, from pesticide poisonings to a decline in global biodiversity. So in this book, I examine the place of South India's organic farming movement in our contemporary globalized food system. My aim has been to complicate the conversations about food imports and the role of sustainable agriculture in places like India. Stories from Kerala's organic producers illustrate the fact that the debate around organic agriculture must move beyond taste and whether consumers should purchase local food. As a political movement, organic agriculture can be much more. In fostering grassroots political empowerment, in protecting the health and well-being of farmers and their families, and in constructing mutually beneficial trade relationships. Organic farming in India represents one positive step toward reforming industrial agriculture and ensuring a healthier, more sustainable future for all of us, producers and consumers around the world alike. So that's a little bit of an intro into why I wrote the book. And now I thought I'd rapidly go through the organic farming movement in India to give you a little bit of what is actually going on there. Organic farming represents something different and exciting in India's, particularly Kerala's, agriculture. Organic farming is rapidly growing. Between 2003 and 2010, the area under certified organic agriculture grew by almost 2,500%. For the sake of comparison, the rate of growth for the area under certified organic production here in the US was just 12% between 2008 and 2011. Over 500,000 organic farmers live in India, the highest number of organic producers of any country in the world. Some estimates suggest that organic retail within the country may even be growing at a rate of 100% per year. And in 2009, Indian farmers sold $100 million worth of organic goods, such as rice, spices, and fruit to Europe, the United States, and other countries. Market estimates forecast this amount doubling by the end of this year. To understand why this is so revolutionary, I thought I'd just quickly explain the absurdities, and I call them the absurdities of industrial agriculture. So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from the first chapter of the book. So industrial agriculture is fossil fuel and energy intensive, highly dependent on artificial inputs of fertilizers and pesticides. Farmers rely on machinery and grow monocultures on large plots of land. Livestock operations are concentrated, and much of the labor is low wage. One of the main goals of such agriculture is to produce high yields, ideally for greater profits. Unfortunately, profit margins tend to be thin in industrial agriculture, as unpredictable weather can destroy crops, and since unpredictable global markets and free trade agreements can depress commodity prices. Boom and bust cycles are the norm. As such, farmers are constantly under pressure to extract profits where they can, whether through cheaper labor or by cramming livestock into smaller and smaller areas. The intensification of farm operations has increased nutrient waste runoff into watersheds, led to inhumane practices toward farm workers and animals, and prompted many families to leave agriculture. Corporate entities now control larger shares of agricultural operations around the world, and agricultural activities currently have among the largest environmental footprint of any human enterprise. This is normal, and this is our status quo, and this is how the majority of food is produced in our world today and here in the United States. And these artificial inputs and this way of producing food have had a negative effect on the environment and our health. I'm going to give you some examples of the impacts the industrial food system has had on India. Endosulfan is an example of a chemical pesticide that has negatively impacted the health of people in Kerala. For a quarter of a century, the Plantation Corporation of Kerala, a public sector company, sprayed this pesticide aerially over its cashew plantations and neighboring areas to control pests like mosquitoes. Endosulfan is a broad spectrum, let me see, I might have missed a slide. Well, unfortunately, it's not here, but I had a picture of, if you can picture this, a leaf on a tree in my backyard. And the leaf has trails on it, white trails on it, from an insect called a leaf miner. Leaf miners live in, and the larvae, I should say, of leaf miners live in and eat leaves. And endosulfan is a broad spectrum pesticide that has been used in the United States to control pests like leaf miners. And in Kerala, endosulfan has been used not just for cashews and cashew plantations, but to control leaf miners in coffee. Endosulfan is currently being banned or phased out in the US. It can no longer use it on citrus. It's also being phased out in India, in Kerala. But unfortunately, endosulfan is a persistent organic pollutant, like DDT. It persists in the environment for years and can travel through the air and water. It also bioaccumulates. EPA studies have indicated that endosulfan may disrupt the human endocrine system and negatively affect the nervous system as well. In Kerala, the chemical pesticide has been linked to hundreds of birth defects. And this is just a few newspaper clippings I put together. Endosulfan was regularly talked about in the media when I was living in Kerala. In 2010, the press alone had identified almost 3,000 endosulfan victims. Many of these victims had experienced headaches and nausea after being directly exposed to the pesticide. Many other victims, however, were small children who have experienced abnormal weight gain, delays in reproductive organ development, and skeletal deformities. These chemicals from industrial agriculture are all around us, and I saw this article in The Guardian last year that I found really compelling. Some of these chemicals are so toxic they can just kill frogs in under an hour. These chemicals, as I've seen in the scientific literature, have been found in placentas, breast milk, and umbilical cords before people are even born. And 3 million cases of pesticide poisoning in humans are reported globally each year. Over 250,000 Indian farmers have committed suicide since 1995 due to unbearable debt burdens they built up while trying to industrialize their agriculture. In Kerala, between 2003 and 2007, close to 1,000 farmers took their lives. Many of these farmers were deep in debt and food insecure. They possessed less than 1 acre of land, which they used mostly for the cultivation of commercial cash crops like coffee and pepper. Several of these farmers had taken out loans to purchase agricultural inputs like high-yielding varieties of seeds and chemical fertilizers. And many of these farmers drank pesticides to end their lives. According to the WHO and some other international development agencies, drinking pesticides is actually a common way for farmers to end their lives all over the world, since it's a readily available poison. So I thought I'd talk briefly, and unfortunately I don't have the slides with this presentation, about how the food system in India came to have all these problems. Between 12 and 30 million people are estimated to have died of starvation in India from 1876 to 1902, so thinking back over 100 years. Crop failures caused by erratic monsoon rains contributed to the widespread hunger and malnutrition during these years. However, historians have argued that British colonialism exacerbated the effects of these environmental conditions. So India, the Indian subcontinent, which includes modern-day Bangladesh and Pakistan, used to be a British colony from 1858 to 1947. During this time, the British colonial government imposed several social and economic changes in the region that led to food insecurity and famines during El Niño years around the turn of the 20th century. What happened is British officials transformed the agrarian economy in the area into one oriented towards markets and exports. British officials used taxation and debt to force locals to grow wheat and cotton on a large scale instead of growing a diversity of staple food crops such as pulses as they had before. So food became a commodity that people had to purchase. They no longer were producing food in their communities that they could rely on each year, but they had to sell the outputs from their agricultural production, like they had to sell their wheat and make money from that in order to then go buy food. This is something that's radically different that happened in India and actually all around the world. And it has roots in industrialization and colonialism. This new system of producing food exacerbated the problems caused by changing weather patterns. So you have these ecological and historic and economic factors come together to create famine in India. Normally, India experiences two monsoons, or tropical rainstorms, one from the southwest from June through September, and another from the northeast before the year ends, around October. During El Niño, a global climate phenomenon that occurs every 3 to 6 years, the Indian monsoons deliver less rain, often producing drought. When the El Niños brought drought to India during British rule, most Indians found themselves ill-equipped to deal with the consequences. So, as I mentioned, if a wheat crop failed one season, perhaps because of drought, a farmer would earn no income and would therefore be unable to buy food. Millions found themselves in this situation at the turn of the century, and therefore you had between 12 and 30 million people die of famine in India from 1876 and 1902. So this famine has been has been a shadow that has haunted Indian policy for decades. So after all of these ongoing food shortages that kept going even after independence from the British Empire, the Indian government decided it had to pursue different policies to deal with this. So in the 1960s, the Indian government pursued something called the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution, really quickly, continues along this tradition of industrializing and intensifying agriculture. It's basically a system of science and technology that revolves around food crops. So the government during this time introduced new wheat and rice that had been developed by scientists to produce higher yields, again, to deal with these famines. These seeds were hybrid seeds. Seeds that produce a first generation of vigorous, high-yielding plants, but whose progeny were unlikely to be healthy or capable of the same production outputs as the previous generation. Despite that, the Indian government promoted these seeds and technologies throughout India, and the government subsidized prices for inputs such as fertilizer and funded large infrastructure projects around water and irrigation to promote the purchase, planting, and growth of high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice. Scientists and policymakers actively encouraged farmers to buy these technologies, and they also encouraged farmers to use these seeds in conjunction with pesticides, chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizers to obtain high yields of wheat and rice and other crops. In Kerala, you had the Green Revolution centered around rice because Kerala is a rice-producing state, and also around black pepper. Kerala is tropical, and so it has specialized in spices for years. And in fact, if you go and read, if you're interested, and you read the travel writings of Marco Polo and Christopher Columbus, they refer to black gold from the Malabar coast of India, which is what black pepper was called. So to take advantage of this black gold, the state government in Kerala actively promoted Green Revolution technologies around pepper to really increase the production output around pepper. And it recommended that farmers use pesticides and chemical fertilizers to maintain yields, high yields of black pepper. I'm sorry I don't have the slides for these. I had a few interesting slides. Unfortunately, despite these technologies, I'll talk about pepper. Kerala's pepper plants began to wilt and die off on a large scale in the 1990s. Thank you. This fungus called Phytophthora is a fungus that's actually present here in the United States. Someone told me it's responsible, I believe, I'm not the authority, but I believe it is responsible for sudden oak death. That's what I've heard, but I do know, in any case, that it is a fungus that's present in the United States, Phytophthora. It affects pepper plants in Kerala, and in the 1990s, there was a big Phytophthora epidemic, and it caused pepper production to collapse in an unprecedented magnitude. And scientists that I spoke with are convinced that Phytophthora was proliferated because a lot of its natural enemies, including another fungus, had disappeared from the soil because the soil no longer had these microorganisms and was no longer healthy because of constant chemical applications. Phytophthora has caused losses equivalent to 2,000 tons of pepper per year, valued at several $1 million annually. And this has made farmers extremely vulnerable to debt, which is one of the reasons why there's a large farmer suicide problem in Kerala and India. So things are changing in India, which is what I showcase in the book. In Kerala, farmers and activists and policymakers are pursuing organic farming to break their dependence from these chemical inputs and from external markets. And as I mentioned, in 2010, after years of negotiations, the state finalized a policy to convert the entire region to organic farming within 10 years. Funding for organic farming from the state is now around $2 million. 15,000 farmers in Kerala are now already or in the process of being certified organic for export to the US and Europe. So I thought I'd explain these images in a little bit more detail. So what you have here, and it looks like it's a little bit cut off. Let's start here at the top left. The person with this contraption, this green contraption, is weeding paddy fields. The contraption is called a cono weeder, and that is a way of weeding paddy fields without relying on chemical pesticides. Basically, when you push this along through the rows of paddy fields, it digs up weeds. On the right, the bottom right, is a drum filled with a mixture called panchagavya, and it is a mixture, a fermenting mixture of products from a cow, urine, dung, milk, etc. It smells pretty bad, but plants benefit from this application of panchagavya. And in fact, there's science out there that shows applying inputs like panchagavya can restore the organic matter of soil, improve soil fertility, and boost plant growth. So moving along to the right, you see a farming couple, and some rice towards the top. But more and more farmers are starting to save their seeds. And this farming couple is planting a variety of rice called navara. It's a red rice native to the region of Kerala, and it has medicinal properties. And more families like that and organizations are saving different varieties of rice which have properties like saline tolerance and drought tolerance, which are very important going ahead into the future because climate change is likely going to make Kerala hotter, more dry, and there's going to be an increase in sea levels, so there'll be more saltwater incursion into paddy fields. On the right, all the way on the right, is a picture of a cow. But basically, this is a heritage cow that was subsidized, that was basically given to a group of farming families in this one area of Kerala where I did research by the government, so that these families could rely on the dung and urine from the cow to make things like panchagavya. Moving down, there are growing markets for organic produce. I mentioned earlier that organic retail within India may be growing at a rate of 100% per year. That's an estimate that I found. And on the right is an image of organic cucumbers that I saw in a farmer's field. And these are varieties of cucumbers that you don't see in the markets here in the US. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's growing government support for organic farming. And I think that's a very important story for organic farming in India. Bless you. So for me, talking about what's going on in India has been very important given these criticisms that we've been seeing of organic farming in the past few years. So this is a high-profile criticism of organic farming based on a slide is cut off here, but it's a Stanford University School of Medicine study of organic farming. And I'll read again from the first chapter to give you a sense of what the study was and is. So one of the critiques of organic food is that it offers limited nutritional benefits, even though it costs a lot more money at the grocery store than conventionally grown food. This gained traction with this 2012 Stanford University School of Medicine paper entitled, "Are Organic Foods Safer or Healthier Than Conventional Alternatives?" After reviewing over 200 English language studies of nutrient and contaminant levels in organic foods from January 1966 to 1966, to May 2011, the authors concluded that the published literature lacks strong evidence that organic foods are significantly more nutritious than conventional foods. Subsequently, social media and news outlets buzzed with discussions about the benefits and drawbacks of organic food consumption. So this New York Times article ran with the headline, "Stanford Scientists Cast Doubt on Advantages of Organic Meat and Produce." NPR aired a segment titled, "When it comes to buying organic, science and beliefs don't always mesh." Roger Cohen, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, welcomed the Stanford study, calling organic food elitist and equating it with paying to send your child to private school. Web commentary for these and similar media included statements by consumers who no longer wished to buy organic food. And so, a lot of folks are starting, again, to question the integrity of organic food, its nutritional properties, the benefits, whether or not it's worth to buy organic food and support organic food production and consumption. There are several reasons why organic food is usually more expensive than its conventional counterparts in a grocery store. One is that the limited supply of organic foods can drive their price up. Furthermore, the cost of organic production can often be higher given factors such as the increased reliance by farmers on the manual weeding, like we saw with the Kono weeder, as opposed to relying on chemical pesticides, which can be applied fewer times with fewer labor costs or lower labor costs. Price premiums vary, though, depending on the season, crop, and marketing venue. Sometimes organic and non-organic foods actually cost the same. Even the controversial Stanford study pointed out that organic products were likely to have fewer chemical residues, many of which can be linked to negative health effects. Again, I talked about the effects of endosulfan on the health of people in Kerala. This is a very complicated slide that some of you may have already seen before. Another argument against organic food is that it has become co-opted, or the organic farming movement has become co-opted by large corporations, especially here in the United States. So what you have here, in yellow, you have entities, corporate entities like Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and In green are these smaller organic food companies that many people have associated with particular values. And what this illustrates is, are the mergers and acquisitions that have happened in the organic food industry here in the United States. And activists argue that because you have these mergers, because you have Coca-Cola now basically, because it has acquired companies like Honest Tea and Odwalla, organic farming standards are being watered down. And this has been another criticism of organic food, something that, again, I argue in the book, against in the book. Whether or not organic farming is outgrowing its ideals is a major question that is facing the organic farming movement today. But as I mentioned, I use in this book Kerala and India as examples as to why we really should question this question, these skepticisms. I think while there have been some of these valid controversies over organic food is empowering farmers in places like Kerala, and momentum is growing to do agriculture differently. And this is making a difference in the lives of farmers on an everyday basis. So I thought I'd end with the story of coffee. When people think about coffee, they usually don't associate it with India, but India is actually one of the major coffee growing regions in the world. And Kerala is the second largest producer of coffee in India. In this past year, it produced over 66,000 metric tons of coffee. British planters introduced coffee into Kerala in the 1800s, and area farmers, finding that coffee fared well in the state's humid climate, continued to plant it after independence. The state government also encouraged coffee cultivation, just like it encouraged pepper cultivation, after independence from the British Empire to bring foreign revenue into the area. This is what a typical coffee bush looks like in the region of Kerala where I did my work. So basically what you have is the coffee bush at the bottom, and then in the background you have trees that are producing shade. These trees are also commercial crops. And I may have another picture depending on what version of this PowerPoint, what version I'm using. But typically in Kerala you have pepper growing as a vine on these shade-producing trees. So you have several crops growing with the coffee. So prior to the rise of the organic farming movement, farmers had been selling the entirety of their coffee to local and regional agents and shops. Much of this coffee would end up in blends marketed by national and multinational corporations such as Nestle, Tata Coffee, and Hindustan Lever. Despite being one of the largest producers of coffee in India, these farmers were not known for their high-value coffee, and they did not trade directly with international buyers. They never set the price for their coffee either. Things changed once a lot of these farmers converted to organic farming. Many of these farmers that I worked with are now part of a group called Organic Wayanad that has a steady connection for the past, has had a steady connection for the past few years with a large coffee buyer based in Germany. Each year, this buyer purchases about 18 tons of organic coffee at a premium price directly from these farmers. After receiving a request from these farmers, this buyer also now makes these arrangements several months in advance, in the fall, before the coffee is harvested. So in India, coffee is harvested around our winter months, December and January. So coffee is going to be harvested next month. This advance was negotiated to guarantee to these farmers a market for their coffee and to help them during their growing season. Here's a picture of these farmers collecting coffee to bring to the buyer. About 3 years ago, the global price of coffee increased between the fall and winter, and these farmers found that the price that they had negotiated in the fall several months earlier with the buyer to look pretty poor. So they opened up negotiations again and eventually came to a new agreement with the buyer who agreed to purchase the farmer's coffee at a higher price. So I want to emphasize what happened here because I think it's very important. So in November 2010, the market rate for coffee, non-organic coffee, was 38 rupees per kilogram. And at the time, this German buyer negotiated with these organic farmers that the buyer would purchase the coffee at 51 rupees per kilogram, so several rupees above the market rate. Between November and January, however, the price for coffee rose, and there are a lot of debates as to why that happened, including the fact that Brazilian coffee production dropped unexpectedly that year. So the price of coffee rose to 52 rupees per kilogram, which you can see is higher than what these farmers had negotiated in November. So these farmers went back to this coffee buyer, this German coffee buyer, and negotiated a higher price, 55 rupees per kilogram. So above the non-organic coffee rate and above what they had negotiated in November. This type of bargaining is uncommon, particularly in conventional coffee markets in the developing world. And organic farming really created these opportunities for direct negotiation. And during a monthly meeting, these farmers agreed to utilize the profits from this and previous orders towards school scholarships for the children of group members. I should mention that they were also Fairtrade and organic. So I talk about how exactly organic farming created this opportunity in the book, because it's a very complicated story about how this buyer and these farmers came to connect. But I do want to say that whether these farmers were happy with the eventual price they ended up getting is something that I also discuss, and the answer to that question is not simple. And I will end by saying that the answers to this question, what should organic farmers grow, rice or spices? Should farmers continue growing coffee and pepper and connect with these premium export markets, or should they grow rice for domestic consumption, especially given India's famine? That's history of famines. That hasn't been an easy answer for policymakers or farmers. When I found that question has is very similar to this question: which apples should we buy? Should consumers buy? And a lot of that basically has to do with this, how our food system has come to be structured, and the politics of the food system. So that's it from me. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. Yes?
From the Stanford study, I remember hearing, I don't know if you may have seen me kind of shaking my head in the back there. Because I heard a lot about it from other people, and it really frustrated me when I tried to talk about organics with a friend of mine, and when they were saying how organic food is just as nutritional as other types of food, it just proves just how much, for example, when something gains momentum, the only analogy I can make is Roe versus Wade and how it gained momentum during the 70s, and now people are just trying to cast doubt on it, and there's probably people who are bitter about the whole thing, and just because they're losing their power, I guess. But it's just the same as happening with the organics revolution. How do we bring the conversation, just not preaching to the crowd? I think it's just really important to bring up that study and just how flawed it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, a few things I want to say. Thank you for your comment.
Could you try to capture her question?
Yes. Your comment was that you did not like the Stanford University School of Medicine study that claimed that organic foods are not more nutritious than conventionally grown foods. Is that correct?
I mean, I just it's once you gain momentum and there's just all this doubt that's cast on it. It's very, because people who are for organics and for permaculture, and it's just this constant preventing people from going forward and making future steps to improve our agricultural system. I don't know, was her comment to bounce it back as a question?
Oh no, I'm just repeating it. Oh yeah, and to add to that, I think you're frustrated that something like this has been gaining in prominence, maybe, especially as the organic farming movement is trying to move forward. So I will have a few things to say. The first is one of the things I currently work on. I actually work for a nonprofit called Healthcare Without Harm, and we work Healthcare Without Harm. Harm. And I work for their food group, and we're thinking about food differently, the nutritional benefits of food, and what does healthy food mean? Because this is a question that hospitals are constantly thinking about, or they are starting to think about now, I should say. And the problem with the Stanford University School of Medicine study is its narrow definition of health and healthy. An apple is considered, in that kind of perspective, something like an apple is considered nutritious depending on its vitamin content, for example, or its fiber. But what I argue and what I have been working on is that whether or not the health of an apple really depends on how it was produced. If chemicals went into producing an apple, those chemicals have an effect on our bodies, which have been scientifically documented, which then can lead to hospitalizations. So it's really important to think about how the food that we consume more holistically. It's important to think about production and the system that went behind producing an apple, for example. The other thing I want to say is that there are currently in many markets price premiums for organic food. And this is something that's really debated in the organic farming movement, whether or not there should be a price premium. Some argue that the fact that there is a premium is the reason why farmers are turning to organic farming. And it's really important, especially because yields might go down during their conversion period. And they need to make up that money somehow if their yields go down. Policymakers, scientists, activists need to figure out a way to make sure that healthy food, and again in this my holistic definition of healthy food, is not just a luxury of the rich. I personally think it's absurd that we rely on chemicals to produce what we're putting in our body. And that's something that, and we should make sure that all the food that is produced doesn't rely on that and is available to all. Just to build on your comment.
Do you have any insights into the current trade stuff that's being negotiated in Asia right now? Impact?
Yeah. So one of the trade agreements that was being negotiated. The question is, do I have any insight into the trade agreements that are being negotiated? There's this large one that the U.S. is negotiating. It's like the Transatlantic Trade Partnership. I know very little about that one, if I'm being honest, and a lot of the discussions around that one haven't been very transparent as well. So I know that I'm not the only one that knows very little about that, although people are worried about that because usually with these free trade agreements, and there's evidence of this in India because India has been a part of and is a part of many free trade agreements, including the Association for Southeast Asian Nations free trade agreement. That was a big one that was being negotiated while I was in India. Usually that means markets are opened up internationally. Tariff barriers are not allowed on particular goods, which might protect farmers, etc. I'm really glossing over all the details. But many free trade agreements have tended to hurt many of the farmers in Kerala. So Kerala specializes in coconut production, for example, and with the negotiations of certain agreements under the WTO, oil started being imported into India, and the price for coconut oil dropped. So a lot of the coconut producers in Kerala found that they weren't getting good returns for their oil production as different and cheaper oil started to flood the markets. So free trade agreements really affect commodity prices and the decisions that farmers make about what to grow. And it has, basically, to summarize, had an effect on small farmers in a bad way in India. Yes?
I have an unturned event here, but can you say a little bit about the political circumstances in Kerala that made it possible for this organics law to be enacted?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't talk about that at all. Kerala is a very interesting state. It is one of the few states in India. It's one of the few places in the world, I think the only place in the world, that has democratically elected a communist majority to government. And this communist majority has tended to pursue reforms and policies that prioritize education, universal health care, etc. in Kerala. and it was under a the Left Democratic Front government, which is comprised predominantly of members from the Communist Party, that organic farming was pushed through in Kerala after years of negotiations. So Kerala's political climate has really contributed to the rise of sustainable agriculture and thinking about agriculture differently in the state. But I do want to add that, this was something that was debated, and Kerala is, not only does it have a large communist presence, it has a large Christian presence, has a large Muslim presence, it has a large Hindu presence as well. But there are many folks in parts of Kerala's Christian community that are in favor of organic farming, but didn't necessarily like how the communist government wanted to pursue organic farming. So this is a long way of saying that how organic farming is evolving in Kerala is something that is very debated due to its unique history. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes.
I can't help but ask from a waste perspective.
Please, yeah.
About 15% of what ends up in our local landfill is food waste, and that's a huge point of contention as far as producing methane, hitting back the environment, and wasting all the resources that went into making that food. And that very rarely comes up in the conversation, at least in Iowa, that I'm familiar with, about increasing production. So can you, that's more of a comment, but can you comment on that in the situation in Kerala and how waste plays into markets or doesn't play into markets?
So the question is, what is the role of waste and how does waste factor into some of these markets in Kerala? Some of the organic, well, that's a big question. I'll just start by saying that. I will say that many of the organic farmers I was working with were thinking creatively of how to use their waste, such as through composting, various composting methods. They were relying on vermicompost, worm bins, and other forms of compost to create natural fertilizers that they could use to then amend their soil. So we're starting to see more of, I'm trying to think of, using all parts of food and agriculture in the organic farming movement in Kerala to decrease waste and to bolster soil fertility. In the developing world in particular, I've noticed that people were much more creative about waste, even though there isn't necessarily centralized or well-developed recycling policies because of the level of poverty that you'd see, and because things like buying a bottle of water are relatively expensive. You'd see people really creatively using things like plastic and other materials. That has had its downsides as well, actually. There's this really famous case that happened in Bihar, a state in India. Several school children, I actually talk about this in this book, were poisoned after eating food that had been contaminated with this very toxic chemical pesticide. It turns out that the oil used to cook the food was stored in a recycled drum that used to contain the pesticide. There's some creative recycling happening in India, especially around food waste and compost, but there definitely needs to be more monitoring and regulation over waste. So I hope that answers your question somehow. Anything else? Any other comments? All right, thank you.